Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. Seattle is in earthquake country, and our most recent big reminder of that came 25 years ago this Saturday when the Nisqually quake shook the Puget Sound region. Seattle's historic Pioneer Square neighborhood was hard hit, and a lot's changed as a result of it. More about how the neighborhood has grappled with its vulnerability and its history in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. Public health officials are recommending that more than 130 people associated with Seattle's Rainier Beach High School get tested for tuberculosis. A person with ties to the school recently tested positive for TB, which can spread through the air. Officials say TB is not easy to spread. It typically requires prolonged exposure, but health officials are working with the school to directly contact people who they recommend get tested. Washington's Department of Natural Resources says some recreation sites could close due to current and future funding issues. The agency says it took a $7 million state funding cut in 2025, which eliminated half of its field capacity to do trail and campground maintenance. Budget proposals being circulated right now would cut even more from DNR's budget. The agency says it took a $7 million state funding cut in 2025, which eliminated half of its field capacity to do trail and campground maintenance. Budget proposals being circulated right now would cut even more from DNR's budget. The agency says campgrounds at Bear Creek and Anderson Lake could fully close, and other trails and campgrounds could have reduced service. State lawmakers have until March 12th to finalize the supplemental budget. And check out this KUOW event tonight. We partnered with the Seattle Public Library for a series of book talks. Tonight, KUOW's Katie Campbell will sit down with author Cole Thrush to talk about his new book, Wrecked: Unsettling Histories from the Graveyard of the Pacific. It begins at 6:30 at the Seattle Central Library downtown. We're back with more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. If you live in the Seattle area long enough, it's only a matter of time before you experience an earthquake. The smallest temblors are a mere shimmy. The largest become indelible memories.
In the 65 quake, I was at orchestra practice at John Muir Elementary School.
Cascade PBS's Knut Berger remembers the 1965 Puget Sound earthquake like it was yesterday. We recently met up near the pergola in Pioneer Square.
It was 8 in the morning, and I played French horn. And when the quake hit, it was a good one. And I put my French horn over my head. I protected myself. But there were cracks in the ceiling. I mean, the school was permanently damaged.
I was new to the city during the Nisqually quake and out in Pioneer Square in a parking garage when it hit and was completely unprepared and was actually pretty convinced that it was a truck driving by that was kind of rumbling the things around me until I noticed that the light fixtures were moving back and forth.
Yeah.
And I did the dumbest thing I think imaginable and got in my vehicle and started to drive out of that parking garage. And even the guy at the ticket place, because I went to pay, looked at me like I was crazy. And then there was another guy, and he looked at me. We're all just looking at each other because at that point the earthquake had ended, and he said, that was about a 6.8. And he was on
right
the money. And
on
you
the
know
money.
what? I had a parking garage ticket stamped for like right around the earthquake time at my desk until it faded away.
Oh, that's
till
awesome.
the print
What
faded
a great
away.
Souvenir.
That parking receipt was also a reminder about what not to do during a quake, and I can easily say I've learned a lot since then. This Saturday marks 25 years since the 6.8 Nisqually quake shook the region. Thousands of buildings were damaged. Pioneer Square, Seattle's original downtown, was particularly hard hit due to the glut of historic stone and brick buildings in the neighborhood. These buildings are unreinforced masonry, the most deadly during an earthquake. Amanda Hertzfeld is the unreinforced masonry program manager for the city of Seattle.
I describe it as the knee bone not being connected to the leg bone. So the walls and the floors and the roofs can all separate in an earthquake, leading to collapse.
The businesses and occupants of the historic buildings in Pioneer Square have changed many times throughout the years. Musician Thomas Marriott says before the Nisqually quake, it was the epicenter for the city's jazz scene.
For most of us musicians who came up in the 80s and 90s, we came up playing on First Avenue in Pioneer Square. That's where all the gigs were. A lot of our regular jazz venues were in Pioneer Square. Parnell's, Ernestine's, the New Orleans Creole Restaurant, the Penthouse. These were all Pioneer Square jazz institutions for decades.
The Pioneer Square jazz scene changed in the aftermath of the quake.
Kind of the last holdout and kind of the anchor of all of that was the Phoenix Underground. And so the Nisqually quake kind of put that venue out of business. And then it kind of all folded from there.
The historic building that housed Phoenix Underground was severely damaged. The facade fell off, just a pile of bricks on the sidewalk. The repairs were too costly for the uninsured owners, so the business moved. To maintain a building in one of the city's most historic districts is a commitment that could be tricky and costly. Due to its rich history, Pioneer Square is both a National Historic District and a local preservation district.
When people talk about neighborhoods being the soul of the city, this one feels like that, but on steroids. It's the oldest neighborhood in Seattle, right? It's got all this fabulous Victorian-era architecture. And let's face it, Seattle architecture, before that it burned down, right? Or it's been torn down. So it's just this kind of gem. And it's everything that's happened in Seattle at one time or another has happened here. It was a gold rush, the center of the gold rush and the fleecing of the miners.
Yeah.
And it was Sin City. It was the first logging industry was here, the Yesler's Mill, and there have been lots of riots here, labor riots and anti-communist riots and Mardi Gras riots. It's just everything has happened here, and I think it's fabulous that people had the foresight to create a historic district that would preserve it for us.
There's still some cobblestones here, the pergola stands, lots of reminders of Pioneer Square's earlier days here. Let's talk a little bit about what this place looked like prior to the Nisqually quake, because it was 25 years ago, but, a lot of people weren't living here, and it is different from when it was back then, what it looked like back then.
Yeah, there have been a number of quakes over the years, 49, 65, 2001. Some of the brick buildings were permanently damaged. I was just looking, there's a small building next to the Geo Guy Metropole building, which has just been completely refurbished. They built with brick after the fire in 1889 because they were not going to burn down again. But nobody was really thinking about earthquakes.
There were a lot of bricks in the street, actually, after the Nisqually quake. The facade came off a couple of the buildings.
Right, the place where the Klondike Museum is, that
Yep.
whole facade came down and had to be refurbished.
Yeah. That was February 28th, 2001. Now, can we still see reminders of that quake today? Because this was actually, when the national news was rolling video of the Nisqually quake, it was Pioneer Square. So I wonder if there are still reminders around here. I know the parking garage is still here.
Well, I'll tell you, I think the biggest reminder is what's not here, and that's the viaduct.
Oh, yes.
The viaduct, it had been controversial for years, but people got used to it and whatnot. So much of parts of Pioneer Square down to the waterfront are all built on fill, right? And we know what happens in fill. That's why the earthquakes that happen here tend to be worse because, Occidental is built on fill. That used to be sawdust, right? And in earthquakes, the ground gets really goopy. So the viaduct was damaged in the quake. It was kind of sinking anyway, slowly, but they could kind of mitigate that. But it was really the Nisqually quake that was the catalyst for we got to tear it down. We got to do an alternative, a surface thing, a cut and cover tunnel, or, as we ended up with, Big Bertha.
Yeah, that was the moment where I think you put the cracks on the news, and nobody felt safe on the viaduct
right,
anymore.
Exactly. And I think, no matter how some people were nostalgic about the viaduct, some people hated it, but that was the moment where people were like, ooh, okay.
Back in the day, the viaduct was often the best route from the airport and offered out-of-town guests panoramic views of downtown and the Olympic mountain range. But from below, the viaduct towered over the waterfront with a noisy soundtrack. The last vehicles crossed in 2019, and while there's still some nostalgia for the structure, once the viaduct came down, the Pioneer Square neighborhood connected to the waterfront in a way that hadn't been experienced since the 50s.
One of the things I like about it is when you get off the ferry, you get to see the other side of these buildings. You can see, here's this old town that when the viaduct was there, it was completely blocked. It looked like a great place to get mugged, And
it was quite a scene.
It was grim.
Yeah, it was.
For all kinds of reasons. Yeah.
The viaduct coming down was a big deal for the neighborhood, but the challenge of retrofitting Pioneer Square's old brick buildings remains. Often, it takes a mixture of political will and philanthropy.
It requires money. It requires investment. I think the thing that Pioneer Square has in its favor is it's a historic district. It works within the limitations, which I'm sure is frustrating as heck sometimes for the businesses here. But also, it gives you a sense of security. Nobody can come in with a wrecker and just start tearing things down because there's another, the AI boom wants to put all its employees down here.
The city has repeatedly tried to mandate that buildings with unreinforced masonry be retrofitted, but the reality is many of the buildings in the Pioneer Square neighborhood are at risk. Retrofitting a building could increase rents. The city's Amanda Hertzfeld says building owners consider affordability for tenants.
The issue to retrofit has always been cost. There was actually legislation passed after the 1965 earthquake that said you have to retrofit these buildings, and it was specific to Pioneer Square. And that legislation was repealed very quickly because it was too expensive for building owners. So the question then is, how do we reduce the cost of these retrofits?
To help, the city updated its code in 2024 to codify minimum standards for seismic retrofits. The city has also worked to make this work more accessible for building owners, reducing requirements and costs for permits. Still, more than 1,000 buildings in Seattle require seismic retrofits.
The Nisqually Earthquake was 25 years ago, and we need to move faster than geology when it comes to making ourselves safe and ready for the next earthquake.
Architect Matt Alfs has worked to shore up some of the city's most dangerous buildings, including ones that have sustained damage from earthquakes, like the Metropole, originally built in 1892. It needed a full seismic retrofit.
Here's the building now restored. We were able to restore this really beautiful sandstone facade. It's sort of a carved sandstone facade. It had been covered in, I think, 7 layers of paint, and you couldn't really see the stone.
Preservation and functionality is tricky, and Matt has gotten creative.
And if you walk down here a little bit, I'll show you, we reconstructed 2 upper floors that had collapsed in the 1949 earthquake.
Oh, wow. I can see it, yeah.
So let's go a little further. So the Metropole is actually 2 buildings that are joined, right? And there's a famous photograph. It was a 4-story building. Up until recently, it was only 2 stories because those 2 upper floors collapsed in 1949. There's a series of photos of cars parked right here that are completely crushed. And everyone's standing around staring at it because the facade fell onto the sidewalk and crushed these parked cars.
A lot has changed in Pioneer Square over the years, but since the Great Seattle Fire in 1889, the threat of earthquakes and falling bricks has loomed over the neighborhood. Still, Canute says there are intangible things about this place that haven't changed.
Well, I think it still has that feeling of a place that's continually becoming itself, becoming its new version of itself. I remember coming down here in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was in high school, but there were art gallery openings, there were new restaurants opening up, and it was kind of a place of urban exploration. and there were things that would, to attract people who love the arts or people who loved history, and that was something Seattle didn't really have before, and I think it has been a way that Seattle has been able to kind of define its character, and I think that finding that balance between, a fancy French bistro, an underground tour telling you about all the quirks of our sewage system and other things. That just is sort of Seattle. It's not a pretentious place.
Yeah.
It's unpretentious. And I think that is part of our, character that kind of continues. I'm happy to see it.
Pioneer Square has maintained its character through decay and renewal. During the pandemic, the neighborhood suffered, businesses shuttered, foot traffic declined, but now there's renewed attention, in part thanks to the growing popularity of Pioneer Square's long-running art walk and free jazz nights. Thomas Marriott's organization, Seattle Jazz Fellowship, organizes these events, which feature local jazz musicians every week in venues throughout Pioneer Square, just like the old days.
I think part of it is Pioneer Square is still seedy enough that it's appealing to young people who want to live on the edge, but it's also safe enough for people to come down and feel like it's not a big deal. I think one thing that people like me who are from Seattle appreciate is when things don't change. And certainly the neighborhood has changed, but a lot of it hasn't changed. And that there's a lot to be said for that. I think in a lot of ways, I see people getting high in the alley, and I'm like, yeah, people have been getting high in that alley since like the beginning, since they made that alley. You know what I mean? This is the continuity between the past, present, and future that, frankly, I think that's what's appealing to jazz folks, because that's what the music is. The past, present, and future are all in the same instant. I think Pioneer Square kind of has a little bit of that.
The city of Seattle is commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Nisqually quake tonight at City Hall. Earthquake and building experts will be on hand to share tips on how to prepare for the big one. Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now, and thank you to our generous donors for your financial support. Take a minute to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. Today's episode was produced by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. It was edited by Andy Hurst. Our production team also includes Vaughn Jones, Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. We're back tonight with evening headlines.